So my civilization was a beehive, and its name was Honeycomb Hollow. It was located in a large forest in Maine, and I wasn't specific because the bees really didn't know where they were. It was located on a pine tree, and the forest was very wet and damp, which was good because it provided a really reliable source of water. And as we know, water is necessary to any civilization, so they needed to find a place where they could easily access water. Another reason why they chose this location was because it was around a lot of flowers, so it was easy to get pollen and create honey, which is the bee's #1 food and jobs, like supplier. So like these flowers are supposed to represent like where they get their pollen. Two of the most important geographic features in my hive were the water fountain and the honey fountain and storage. So the water fountain takes runoff water from like the trees and rain and basically funnels it into a pool at the center. And it also takes snow from winter as it like melts off the trees and everything. The water is accessible to any bees no matter what. It's just like if you go to a river, but instead it's a water pool. So the honey and honeycomb storage is this like honey fountain, and then all the honeycomb is where they store it. So when the gathering bees collect the pollen from the flowers, they dump it into this pot, and I kind of tried to show the pollen right there. And the honey maker bees mix the pollen to create honey, and then they put it in the honeycomb for storage. So the honeycomb basically wraps around the entire beehive because there's so much honey. And yeah, honey is their #1 food supply and the #1 job provider too. So another geographic feature is the housing. So this huge house right here is for the queen bee, and then the little house up there for like the average bees. And I didn't have any slaves in my civilization, so there's only 2 classes. And then religion in my hive, so there wasn't really religion, but they did worship the queen and like her power. So every Friday there was a worship, and one of the laws in my hive was that if you skipped worship 3 times, then you were removed from the hive or banished from the hive. So there are many other jobs besides the queen bee. For example, there was a gathering bee which gathered all the pollen to create honey, and they're one of the only bees that were allowed out of the hive, so it was very like enclosed because of like dangerous things out of the hive. There's also reporter bees, so they were also allowed out of the hive because they went to other areas and other hives to report back to the queen bee as what was going on in the other hives. There's also the honey makers, which I talked about earlier, and they were the ones that made the honey and put it into storage. And that was one of the most important jobs. And there's also servants of the queen bee, so I guess you could kind of compare them to slaves, but I just put them under like the average bee category because they still got rewarded for their work. So it's not like they were slaves. That was just their job. They were just servants of the queen. The last job that was actually allowed out of the hive was law enforcement. So law enforcement enforced every law in the hive, which I'll talk about later. And anything that was suspicious was reported back to the queen, and she would decide like what to do about it. Yeah, so they basically just made sure the bees are following the laws. So there are exactly like 20 to 30 laws in the hive. I'll just give 3 examples. So one was that every bee must be at worship, and worship occurred every Friday. And if they weren't, they were banished from the hive after 3 times. If there was a valid excuse ahead of time, then it was like excuse. So like, for example, like an excused absence in school is basically like that, except there's a lot bigger punishment. Also, if you leave the hive without having a specific job that allows you to leave the hive, then you are banished or locked in jail. And then that decision is ultimately up to the queen. And then the last one is if you mess with the queen or any like law enforcement or the queen, which are like the higher power, I would say, you are also locked up or banished. Okay, so for government, there's only one government, and that was the queen, and her like servants were like her helpers. So they would report back to her, they would ask other people about what was going on in the hive, and they were just like did anything for her basically. The next like kind of more powerful bee was the police bees, and then there was the common bees. And in my civilization, the bees did vote on some laws. So for example, like the laws that were a little bit less like needed to happen immediately. You kind of know what I'm saying? But if there was a law that needed to go into act right away because of something that happened, then the queen could just put that law into act. There was social hierarchy in my hive. So obviously the top was the queen bee, and then there was law enforcement, and then the commoners or average workers. And I did put, like, again I said, I did put the servants under average workers, but you could put them under the average workers, but I kind of kept them in the same area because they got rewarded for their work. It was just like any other job. And there was not a set system of social hierarchy, like it wasn't this is how it is. That's just basically how all the bees in the hive went. They knew to like respect their queen and respect the law enforcement. They just knew that was how it was. Okay. So then, yeah, so I had the key basically explains every location. So I don't know if you guys can see it from there, but every bee is a different color. So the red one is representing the queen bee's house. The blue one is representing the water. The orange one is representing where the bees dump the pollen. And the purple is representing like the fountain of honey in the middle of the hive. And then this like pink, like maroonish one is representing the honey storage. So like the honeycomb and stuff. And, or that was representing like the pot where the honey is like done basically. And then the yellow is representing the honeycomb. And then the green is representing like the average workers' houses. And there's my compass down there. Any questions?